When moving through the demon-infested dungeons of Tristram, you'll come across skeletons, ghouls, and of course, tons and tons of loot. But these are not the only things you will see going through the dark and winding corridors of this underground complex. Sooner or later, you will come across a door, looking like any other door. Opening it won't reveal reanimated corpses or a chest bursting with gold pieces. No, behind it you will find nothing but certain damnation.
Ah, fresh meat.
So in preparation of this, meaty encounter, we first need the means of getting there. In my first video about this Diablo-inspired dungeon set, I built a set of stairs which only leads upwards. So naturally I needed stairs that do the exact opposite, going downstairs. Taking inspiration from the game itself, I decided to build this set of stairs in a similar way I built my wall pieces. First, I figured out the scale I would need, which would be something with a profile of about 3 by 2 inches, which roughly translates to 7.5 by 5 centimeters. For the walls I used a 3 mm thick fin board, which is a wood pulp paperboard, so in a sense very thick cardboard. But of course you can use whatever you have at hand, like foam board or similar materials. I cut the side pieces to a size of 6.5 by 2.5 centimeters and the backside piece to a size of 4 by 2 by 5 centimeters. These I glued together with PVA, and the resulting structure I simply adhered to a piece of crafting paper, which I cut to a size of 6 by 5 by 5 centimeters. Now, with all that, I started to add the pillars that are typical in the Diablo dungeon. All this may look very familiar if you have seen my first video about the dungeon set, but if you haven't seen it and you want this bit more detailed, then I highly recommend you check this one out first and come back to this video afterwards. The pillars at the front of the stairs were made exactly like the pillars of the aforementioned dungeon wall. Simply gluing Nerf gun darts to 5 mm thick cork pieces, which I cut to 1.5 cm long squares. I glued them to their designated places and went to the pillars on the back. Here I cut out a quarter so that the pillars and their plinth would fit perfectly to the corners on the backside. With that, I textured the rest of the fin board with my 2 mm thick cork bricks. Now for the top of the structure, I went with the same 5 mm thick cork sheet I used for the pillars. With the measurements of 1.5 by 8.5 centimeters for both side pieces and 1.5 by 3 centimeters for the backside, I first smoothed out the edges with sandpaper and started to carve out a more or less randomized brick pattern to simulate individual bricks. You don't need a Dremel tool if you don't have one for this step. For example, you could simply cut out a small bit with a hobby knife and go back in with a small rounded file to make the gap a bit smoother. After that, I glued them in place. I also added a few cork bricks to actually have some stairs for these, set of stairs. Now with all that, I added my PVA, tile grout, black paint and water mixture. Wiped that from the top of the bricks to preserve the cork texture and let the whole piece dry overnight, just to make sure everything is ready for painting. For that I used the exact same painting scheme of my walls. I based the whole thing in a PVA and black paint mixture. With that, every cork piece gets an additional level of sealing and the piece becomes very sturdy. After that I went in with a dry brush of grey followed by a dry brush of transparent blue. I also went in with a warm off-white to slightly dry brush the exposed edges. The pillars were painted with the same neutral grey, followed by a stippled on purple grey. Something I really like about this dungeon set is its versatility for adding new stuff. And if you remember the dungeon in the first Diablo, you may also remember those pesky prison walls that prevent you getting closer to those dreadful skeleton archers. So, of course, my set needed those as well. As a base for that, I used these plastic gratings you usually use to divide sections of an aquarium. And I have to say, these were pretty perfect for what I had in mind. Every 2 columns add up to almost an inch. So I made a cut every 5 columns with a height of 2 rows. With that I got a wall piece that is almost identical in size to my brick walls. Now I wasn't quite happy with the gaps between the bars, as they were a bit too spacious. To counteract that, I added toothpicks to separate these gaps into 2. I simply drilled holes on the top and the bottom and poked these toothpicks through those holes. With sandpaper I smoothed out the bottom and the sides, while I left the top uneven to imply a higher wall. After that I glued a popsicle stick to the bottom to give the walls a bit more height. The only thing missing were the pillars on the side. These I built beforehand, again gluing half of a Nerf gun dart on top of the cock plinth. I also adjusted the size of the popsicle sticks by cutting off the axes. With that I only needed to glue both parts together, which I achieved with construction adhesive. I had that laying around, but you could use hot glue as well. And after doing all of this 20 times, I had my set of prison walls ready for painting. Here I immediately started with a PVA and black paint mix for the pillars. When this was dry, I started to paint the bars, where I first base coated them in grey, followed by an application of turquoise ink from above and dark violet ink from below. With that I dry brushed the pieces with Vallejo's Tinny Tin. The highlighted areas I dry brushed with silver from the same paint line. Now I have to admit that I did not like that at all. Initially I wanted a hint of violet transitioning to blue, but now the pieces looked a bit too garish in my opinion, so I took my airbrush and coated the bars in steel from Vallejo's metal color line. Following that I reapplied the turquoise ink, this time however from beneath. As last finishing touches I dry brushed the highlights with silver and also selectively applied a very watered down red oxide by Chimera to the recesses. And after painting the pillars, I only needed to add the magnets. Again, I carved out an appropriate indentation on the underside of the cock plinth, added a dab of PVA and added the magnet. Now the last time I did that, some of you wondered if that would hold. Well, here's the proof. You just have to make sure the magnet is completely sealed by the PVA. Thanks to the porous nature of cork, this results in a very strong bond. Now it's time for the star of the show. As the Diablo veterans among you probably already guessed, I also kit bashed an, in my opinion at least, appropriate butcher model. You see, I don't really like where the butcher went in the subsequent games. I think it became way too cartoony, and I really prefer the old design. To stay in that vein, I based my butcher on a Plaguebearer model from Games Workshop. The sickly skin fitted just as well as the bloated belly. I built the miniature as intended until a certain point. On one side, Plaguebearers have these swords, and a butcher demon really needs an appropriate cleaver. So I removed the sword and attached a few bits from my bits box. A wooden handle and a perfectly fitting axe head. I simply attached all with plastic cement. For the head, I deemed all the heads in the kit as not very fitting. But thanks to my assortment of plastic bits, I found this head, which I think is from a crypt horror from GW/Itacords. Anyway, I shortened the neck of the plague bearer and attached the head with a small blob of green stuff. I also added horns to the head that I simply cut from 2 Tyranid bits. At least I think these were Tyranid bits. Now to add the signature apron, for which I used green stuff. I simply mix it by kneading the blue hardener and the yellow filler in equal parts until it's green like the name suggests. After that I rolled out and started to give it a form that resembles an apron. I let it sit for about half an hour and applied it to the miniature. Now I just added 2 twines, which are just 2 green stuff sausages, and also a bit of skin bulge to act as a transition between the head and the horns. After all that conversion work, I adhered the mini to its base and started painting. First I primed the model in Molotov's Traffic Red. After that I applied dark turquoise ink from below. I also re-emphasized the red on the top with another application of Traffic Red from above to fix a bit of unwanted overspill. For the apron, I started with Vallejo's Beastie Brown, following with stipplings of Leather Brown, Plague Brown, and subsequently Bone White. The same steps I also repeated on the horns. For the cleaver, I went with a dark blue undercoat, followed by a stippling of Vallejo Steel metallic paint, and also silver for the highlights. After all that, I mixed myself a dark blue oil wash that I applied liberally across the model. The only part I left out was the apron. All that I let dry for about an hour or so. Now I could remove the wash from the highlighted parts with cotton swabs and sponges. When that wash was completely dry, which can take a day or so, I went in and applied the blood to the apron. Here I went with Gory Red, also by Vallejo. I mostly stippled this on, except for the cleaver where I used brush strokes, going from the blade edge to the opposing side. I also used a toothpick, dipped it in a blob of Gory Red and flipped it in a way so that the paint blotches would land randomly on the model. This was more or less successful, as some of those blotches landed on the skin. Of course, I knew that this would happen. But it just didn't look so well. Overall, I wasn't so happy with the look of the skin at that point, so I went back in with acrylics, namely the aptly titled The Red from Chimera, and added red highlights to the skin, which I finished with small highlights of Vallejo's Sunny Skin Tone. And after fixing up some minor mistakes, the next level of this dungeon was ready for adventurers. Now my adventurers can actually meet the Butcher in all his glory. An encounter that would probably lead to their death. Alternatively, they could lure them behind the bars or trap him between those new stairs, which would make him susceptible to long-range attacks. You see, now you also know how to kill him in the video game. With all that, I thank you for watching. I really hope you liked this video. If so, let me know in the comments. Also, if you like my stuff, please consider leaving a like and subscribe to the channel. We are coming close to the first anniversary of Lenric's Realm. And maybe, just maybe, we can reach the 10,000 subscriber count before that. Again, I am so grateful for your overwhelming feedback in the last month, and I really hope to see you in the next one. Until then, why not check out this video where I build my own Forbidden Psalm warband. Thank you again so very much, and farewell, fellow adventurers.